to Allison Pataki. Hello. How does this sound? Okay, can you guys hear me? Okay. Let's begin with your background. Where did you grow up and when did you become a writer?
Yeah. So hello everybody. First of all, thank you for joining us. And I was thinking on the way in, I'm from New York. You know, this time a week ago, we were digging out of a foot of snow. And in New York, you know better than to plan book events in February because they'll get snowed out. You know better than to plan book events in April because if there's sun after the snow, then no one wants to be inside at a book event. You know better than to plan in August because if it's a summer day, everybody has things they'd rather be doing. I was thinking today, oh my goodness, it's really sunny, it's beautiful. Is this gonna prohibit people from coming? And then I was like, well, they have this weather every day. So you're all very, very lucky and spoiled, and I'm very lucky to be here with you today. So thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. Circuitous way of answering your question, I grew up in New York. I grew up in the Hudson River Valley, which is just an area steeped in history because it was a critical thoroughfare during the American Revolution, prior to the Revolution. And I'm about an hour north of New York City, so you really can't go a quarter of a mile in any given direction without coming into a historical marker. And we always break for historical markers. And so it just really fed my interests and my passions from a very young age to be in this historic area where George Washington referred to the bend of the Hudson River where I grew up as the key to the continent during the Revolution. And that inspired, of course, my first book, The Trader's Wife, which is about Benedict Arnold's treason to turn over West Point and the Hudson River to the British, which would have ended the American Revolution. So I grew up in New York. I've lived elsewhere. I went to school in New England, and then my husband and I lived in Chicago for several years. I lived in Paris before that, but I always knew I wanted to get back to New York, and specifically the Hudson River Valley, with winter jaunts down to Florida, of course, to make it bearable. But I am a New Yorker, and I have been a writer in some shape or form probably since I could write letters, really. I think I have a lot of very distinct memories of my childhood. I'm the third of 4 kids. So I was ignored a lot, and I had a lot of downtime. And as I've mentioned, I lived in the woods of the Hudson River Valley. So I have all these distinct memories of just wandering around by myself and just imagining things and just thinking things and just making up stories. And always in my whole life, still to this day, I can't go to sleep at night without being lost in a story in my head. It's just where my brain goes when I have some downtime. So I thought, given my love of history, given my love of story and narrative, and sort of the natural curiosity that I have, I thought journalism. I thought, what better way than to just ask people invasive questions for a living and then write the stories. And I started journalism internships and volunteering as a college student, and then I got my first job out of college as a writer of journalism, but quickly learned that that was not the right fit. That is writing. That is a very different form of writing. And I realized as I was writing in the newsroom for live television and then later .com, the website, and then I'd be running home at the end of the day or on my weekends or on my time off to be writing fiction as sort of like my dirty little secret, my pastime that I loved doing. And then going to my day job that I did not love doing, I realized I might be in the wrong line of work here. And I think I really do love writing and I do love history, but this is more the type of writing I want to be doing. So I published my first book in 2012. I got my book deal, sold it to Simon Schuster. It came out in 2014. That was The Trader's Wife. And then it's been exactly 10 years this month that I've been a published author, and I've done 10 books. That's what I'm doing. You don't work a day in your life. It's what I love to be doing. It's not a job. It's my passion. It's my college. So hopefully I'll write many more.
Yes, good figures. Thank you. Okay. Several of your novels are about leading ladies of history. Marjorie Post, Empress Elizabeth, aka Sissy, and Desiree Clary. What is your research process of gathering information to write about the lives of these women?
So my passion, well, as a reader, I love historical fiction. Historical fiction is just a genre I gravitate toward. But as a writer, especially, my passion is for telling the stories of these women who have been footnoted or sidelined in history, where we know their time, we know their era, we know all about the men that were there, and yet their stories are not as well known, these women, although they were on front lines, not only participating in history and witnessing history, but having an active hand in shaping it. So I love to tell the stories of women forgotten in history. And so really it has been a very organic, completely haphazard process of how I have met my women. And I know when I meet my next book and I have landed on my next heroine, my next subject, it just really becomes an obsession. And I just become really so compelled to tell this woman's story. And each time it's been different. But as I said, I started with The Trader's Wife. That was the story of Peggy Shippen Arnold, who was Benedict Arnold's wife. I thought, oh my goodness, we grow up learning. Everyone knows the name Benedict Arnold. Many know the name John Andre, who was his co-conspirator, the British spy. Nobody knew this third character in the triangle, Peggy, who's the most fascinating character of all. So I followed sort of the breadcrumbs from one book to the other based on just being obsessed with these women and just not being able to get them out of my head. So when I was trying to sell The Trader's Wife, I was going around to my editorial pitch meetings to try to get an editor to acquire, to land at a publishing house. And I was told time and again, this was in 2012, the American Revolution is just really, doesn't sell in fiction, it's not sexy. David McCullough can write John Adams tomes for that, that people will read, but in terms of fiction, it's not really going to be a hit. And I was saying to them, I know, Martha Washington might not have huge sex appeal, maybe Abigail Adams, but I'm telling you, Peggy Shippen and this love triangle, it's Shakespearean. It is so good. So I convinced someone to take me on, Simon & Schuster, and the book came out. Meanwhile, Hamilton comes out. I think we can all agree that the American Revolution is now a hot topic. But after The Trader's Wife came out and it was a New York Times bestseller, a publisher sat me down and was like, okay, this is so great. You've broken down the door on the American Revolution. This can really be your thing. Find your next woman from the American Revolution, and that's your next book. I was like, well, I've written my next book, and it's a different continent, a different century. It's Empress Sisi of Austria, the last great Habsburg empress before World War I. Again, starting from a place where no one had heard the name, and particularly American readers. In Europe, everyone knows Sisi, but really she's not as well known in America. So then again, an uphill battle of convincing the publisher to take this leap of faith with me that this is a story that readers will want to read, that this woman's story is worthy, and the fact that you don't know her name doesn't mean we shouldn't know her name. And so it's been, I feel like I'm generally starting from a place, and it's a place I like to be, where people might not be that familiar with the name of the woman. And when I tell people the next subject of my book, they might have a touchstone here or there, like, okay, Empress Elizabeth, beginning of World War I. We all learned that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. Oh, that was her heir. Okay, but maybe they know all the men, but they don't know the woman. And so I like starting from that place. And I just always have this gut feeling or this hope that if I'm passionate and obsessed enough, I can tell the story in a way that will bring the readers willingly along. And so that's what I've been doing. So the research is really, because I've hopped all over the place, I've probably given my agent whiplash with American and European, and now I'm back in America. The research is different every time, and the context matters, which century it is, what's available. Marjorie Post is a very recent woman, and her home in Washington, D.C., Hillwood, is a museum. So there is a literal treasure trove of information available about her. My previous book, Desiree Clary, Napoleon's first fiance, there wasn't as much about her. So it's different every time. With Desiree, I had to go to Paris, which was just terrible to research. But really, the research has to begin in the places where the books are set, where the woman lived, where I can soak up as much of her world and the texture of her life, the context of her life, and then really from there, it's just a steady intake of as much information as I can. And then at a certain point in the process, once I've been to the places, once I've absorbed as much of the raw material, the history that I can get, then the woman really begins to come to life for me. And that's when I know it's time to begin writing and segue from the research to the writing. And the woman really sort of takes over from the historical outline to this living, breathing, talking woman who begins to talk to me. And I hear voices in my head, and then it's time to write. And then, of course, as I go along, research keeps coming out. Like what would Marjorie have served at this dinner party in Moscow in the winter, of 1937, or I'll do on-the-spot research for specific questions. Once I feel as though really the bones are laid down by the history, by the raw material, the dates, the true-to-life characters. And then what I'm doing is I'm going in and I'm putting on the flesh and I'm telling the story and I'm bringing the story to life in a way that is historical fiction, not biography.
Thank you for that passion and thank you for bringing those to life.
Well, thank you for reading it so that I can continue to do it.
Your most recent novel, The Magnificent Life of Marjorie Post.
Yes.
Details the life of Marjorie Post, who became the owner of Postum Cereal Company, later renamed to General Foods Corporation, after her father, C.W. Post, passed away. What inspired you to write about her?
Yeah. Oh, such a wonderful woman, such a woman with deep roots in Palm Beach. And I can tell you, when she was coming to Palm Beach, there were not 17 branches of the public library in Palm Beach. When Marjorie was coming to Palm Beach, it was rutted dirt roads and jungle and no nightlife. She was really one of the first people to put Palm Beach on the map and make it a destination. And obviously then with building Mar-a-Lago, she sort of solidified herself as a pace setter of society, but just really, really a strong and looming legacy in this area for Marjorie. But how I found her was, it was 2016, so it was 8 years ago. I had written at that point about Peggy Shippen Arnold and Cece. So I'd written 3 books, 2 on Cece, 1 on Peggy Shippen. And I was visiting my in-laws who had company in town, and as a good mother-in-law, my mother-in-law had forced this house guest to read my books, so she knew that, as you do. And so this friend, I guess, allegedly had enjoyed reading my books, and so she knew that I liked writing these stories about these women from history. And so she said, if you are looking for these women from history, true life heroines, what do you think about Marjorie Merriweather Post? Have you ever considered writing about her? And I will be honest, when this friend, Nancy, suggested the name Marjorie Post, I did not know much about her at all. I was thinking maybe the Emily Post etiquette books that some of my friends were reading in college, or the Washington Post newspaper family. I was sort of thinking some hybrid of like a Meryl Streep movie character playing Kay Graham. I didn't actually know that much about Marjorie Merriweather Post. So what this friend gave me just a few teasers, because she was from Washington, D.C., and she had volunteered at Hillwood, Marjorie's home. So she knew all about Marjorie. She just gave me 4 very dramatic marriages. Come visit Hillwood. You will see her collection of Russian art and the Post Cereal Company, just that she was the empire to this, or she was the heiress of this great empire. And so with just that intrigue sort of whetting my appetite, I went to Washington, D.C., I visited Hillwood, and to walk into Hillwood, I just fell in love with Marjorie. I just got such a strong sense of her impact on history, her character, her life story, and I just kept thinking, how do I not know about this wonderful woman, this magnificent woman? And so I was really hooked. And this was the book that was by far the most challenging for me. It took me 6 years to write. I felt such a sense of sort of humble and earnest desire to get it right because of how much I respected her as a woman and what an incredible life she led, and just knowing this is very recent history. And there's an entire staff of PhDs, archivists, curators, historians who work at Hillwood, her final home, that's a museum now, and their job all day, every day is to preserve her legacy. So I need this to be credible. I need this to be such that a curator at Hillwood could read this book, and though it is a novel of historical fiction, it passes muster for them. And I just wanted to honor her legacy. And I knew that people who were present in moments, in scenes that I'm writing in this book, are very much still alive and very well, her grandchildren, her daughter, Dina Merrill, passed away as I was writing this book. So her grandchildren are still alive, present for some of these moments. So I really wanted to get it right. I wanted it to be an enjoyable, immersive read of a novel, but I also wanted to do justice to the history because the history, the raw material is just so good. And so yeah, that was a great tip. I went to Hillwood, and I knew I had met my next book. And what I say to my husband is, I'm like, I got bitten again, and that's when I know the story has gotten its hooks into me, and then that's going to be my next book, Not Gonna Fight.
Wow. She'd done Marjorie very well. She'd be probably so proud.
Oh, I don't know if she'd be proud. She was like pathologically private, so I think she'd probably hate having her life written about, but I hope she'd be proud. Her family approves, and that was like all I needed to know. And Hillwood invited me to speak, and now they sell my book in the bookshop, so they approved. They even said, the director said, I was going to read it. I was going to make sure that it was up to my standards before I invited you here. She invited me, so.
It's great.
And the granddaughter said, it's really awkward. She said, I loved your book. It's really awkward reading about my grandmother's sex life.
Let's go.
Not that there are lurid scenes in the book by any means, because that's not my style, but.
Okay, to the next question. Philanthropy was a big part of Marjorie's life. She lived through both World Wars and the Great Depression. Can you expand on all the efforts she contributed during her life?
Yeah. A radio reporter said, sort of toward the end of her life, I can't count all of the good things she's done for this city. He was speaking about Washington, D.C., which was her hometown at the time. He said, I would venture she can't even remember all the things she's done. Her largesse and her philanthropy was just so wide. Everything she did was on this grand scale, and that certainly includes her philanthropy and her generosity. And there was so much good that she did that she didn't even ever share or publicize or broadcast that we don't even really know the full extent of it. But yes, you see at every moment in Marjorie's life, I think, her greatest passion, her soul really coming to life when she feels as though she's making a difference. She feels as though she is serving a cause larger than herself, and she is intent on making the world a more beautiful place for others. Marjorie recognized the privilege that she had, and she said, my wealth would have been a burden on my soul had I not found ways to use it to help others. She said, I'm not the richest woman in the world. There are others who are better off than me. The difference is I do more with mine. I put mine to work. And that's so true. So you see it beginning from really a young age. And in World War I, she funds the largest field hospital in wartime France personally twice because something happens, which I won't spoil what happens. And then in the Great Depression, she's hosting everything she can to support the causes, but she's also opening up a food canteen and giving to the Red Cross, working the corner of the street for the Salvation Army, ringing the bell. And people said that they would have this, shock when they would find Marjorie Merritt or the post standing on the corner ringing the bell for the Salvation Army, but she was, going to do her shift just like anyone else who was volunteering. And then you come to World War II, and she's serving as the first ambassadress for the United States to the Soviet Union, and then she comes back and she is in the FDR, the Roosevelt administration. She gives her yacht, the Sea Cloud, for $1 a year to serve in the U.S. Navy. And then you see her just time and again. Really, I got the sense that when there were moments where she was not actively engaged in this huge cause, she would become restless and very sort of disaffected. And then you'd see her pour herself into a cause where she could make life better for just one person or many people. And you get the sense that really that was where she got this great sense of, satisfaction, contentment. And so she was a woman of great privilege, yes, a woman of great affluence. But for me, two of the things that made her so compelling, because that in and of itself is not the story, but it was the philanthropy and it was sort of the human vulnerability with the heartbreak, that in spite of all of the wealth and fortune in the world, she's not immune to the heartbreak that any human being, and sort of to the disappointments in love and interpersonal relationships, and that she doesn't just get the storybook life. And so, yes, philanthropy, I would say her work as the heiress of C.W. Post and this food empire that literally changes the entire American way of life, the entire American diet. So her work, her family, and her philanthropy, those were sort of the three pillars of her life that really make her who she was.
Yeah, she had a very expansive life.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And there were instances like I couldn't even include them all, but like also small moments where anyone in her kitchens or anyone who was on her staff knew if there's anything ever going on with her family, Mrs. Post would want to know about it. She'd want to help. There was just this I guess like this very decent, sort of not flashy humanity to her that I really appreciated.
I noticed that too. Mm-hmm. She was private, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
Marjorie was married to four at all different stages of her life. So how do you think each of these marriages shaped her to be the woman she was?
Yeah, great question. So this was the first time I had ever written about a woman who divorced, where divorce was even an option. And so that was a very new experience for me. And so then to not only take on that, but then bringing the reader along to be willing to fall in love 4 times. And Marjorie was willing to even keep falling in love, even like she teased her daughters up until the end, and she would get married to husband number 5 as soon as she found him. But so Marjorie was a romantic, and Marjorie truly believed each time that she had found her soulmate, and she never stopped hoping for that. And really where you see Marjorie's arc as a character over almost a century of American history, in her evolution, you see really like as a microcosm of the role of women, the American woman in general over the course of the 20th century, how much a woman's life changes just over the course of the 20th century. So when we start with Marjorie as a society bride, literally getting proposed to by Ed Close after a few days, which is how I didn't make any of the circumstances of these courtships up. It was the Edwardian period. It was Downton Abbey. She was this scared girl, really, about to graduate. Her family life had completely imploded. Her father was married to her arch nemesis. And you see Ed Close sort of as this, what looks to be this knight in shining armor coming in to give her a home and give her a family, and give her a place and an identity. And then you see what happens there. And I know we have a mixed crowd where some have read, maybe some have not read, so I don't want to spoil anything, but they don't stay married. That's not too much of a spoiler since there are 4 marriages, so you know Ed Close doesn't last. But in some ways that's a good thing because he goes on to remarry and has more children with the second wife. And then his granddaughter is actress Glenn Close. So we wouldn't have Glenn Close if Marjorie hadn't broken his heart and ended marriage number 1. So then you have husband number 2, Ned Hutton, who was really the love of her life. And that's what the family told me. And they had this passionate affair, and they were rumored to be the inspiration for The Great Gatsby. And that's when Marjorie built Mar-a-Lago with Ned Hutton and the Sea Cloud, her yacht, and Camp Topridge up in the Adirondacks, her great camp, and her estate out on Long Island. So that was a really, really happy, exciting, fast-paced time for Marjorie in the Ned Hutton years. That was the roaring 20s. That was when her company was really beginning to soar, and she was the heiress. But he was also this great business mind, even though he didn't realize the brilliance of the Bird's Eye acquisition, Bird's Eye Frozen Foods. But they really were this great partnership. And then you see the tragedy of how that ends, and it shattered Marjorie. So then you can see how Joe Davies becomes, in the beginning, this very attractive man. He's this international diplomat, and he's expecting this really glamorous posting to London or Paris. It doesn't say anything about Moscow. And he's just sort of the complete opposite from Ned Hutton. And he is all for Marjorie taking her seat on the board of directors after years of her husband, taking her seat on the business table. He really supported her at the beginning with that. And they had this fascinating life together where they traveled the world and they collected Russian art. And then you see what happens with that. And so each one falls apart for very different reasons, particularly then you get to marriage number 4. And she thinks she's found this companion for later in life, and they love the arts and they love philanthropy, and they've both reached a certain stage in their life. And Dina Merrill really says that was a direct quote where she was like, "You mean you didn't know he's gay?" And Marjorie said, "Of course I didn't know. I wouldn't have married him." "You mean you did?" And Dina Merrill just assumed, that everybody knew, that Marjorie knew. But Marjorie, it was purported by her loved ones that she just had this blind spot when she was in love. And she just really believed in true love. She wanted the happy ending. And so really, this was an interesting experience for me writing about it with the 4 marriages, because although she didn't end with some great romantic love story and its happy ending, still it is a life story that is full of love. And there is joy and happiness and certainly contentment and love at the conclusion, with her daughters, with her work, with her friends, with her homes, with the legacy of what she's done in the world. It's a life of beauty. And so really, ultimately, I knew the love story here had to be the story of Marjorie finding her own identity, her own voice, falling in love with herself as an individual, and growing and evolving, and just knowing as the reader, as Marjorie knew as the individual, that every time these shattering heartbreaks happen, she will be okay. And not only will she be okay, but she will grow, and she will be more than okay. And you see that resilience and that grit. And she's just not this princess with this perfect story and storybook ending. She was a human. She had heartbreak, and she picked herself back up, and she really just carried herself with this resilience and strength and resolve. Never gave up on believing in people.
It's amazing how you detailed that, and you caught that in your book. And it's important to have resilience and keep going and find yourself.
Yes. So when I went to Camp Topridge, her camp in the Adirondacks, she had it from the 20s. So she built it with E.F. Hutton. She had the camp through 3 husbands. And you still can see there the bath towels with the different monograms. And what would happen is when she'd get a divorce, she'd go in personally and tear out the monograms and restitch them herself. And the family that owns Topridge, it was kind of joking. She has all the millions in the world. She doesn't buy new towels. She just remonograms the old ones. But yeah, she kept changing her last name, and she ultimately came back to Marjorie Merriweather Crumston. That's how we know. Right around the circle, right back to the post.
Awesome. Okay. There are several different settings throughout the novel. Battle Creek, where she grew up, Greenwich, Manhattan, Washington, D.C., the Soviet Union, the Wood, and our very own Palm Beach. How important is the street for you when writing a novel?
So important. It's really another character. It's really a piece of the story that's interacting with Marjorie, especially because she just built herself such incredible homes. This was not just some split-level raised ranch house. We're talking about Mar-a-Lago. We're talking about Camp Topridge. We're talking about completely remodeling Spatso House in Moscow when she was posted there. She cared a lot about her space and her nest. And so I cared a lot about it and wanted to make that a really rich, delectable piece of the story. And in fact, so anytime she bought a place, she was going to just completely tear it down and rebuild it to the specifications of her perfectionist eye. So my editor pointed out at a certain point in the process, we're doing a lot of home renovations with Marjorie. And while the details are great, we don't want to burden the reader too much. So there were actually homes I didn't even go into. There were multiple New York City apartments. But I knew the biggies were going to be Mar-a-Lago, because that just defied trends. People were building these Mediterranean or Spanish villas with Misner or Wyeth down on Palm Beach when it was really taking off as a destination. Marjorie didn't want to follow the trends. She didn't want another mansion that was going to look like her neighbors. She wanted to break the mold and do something that Palm Beach had never seen before. So her good pal, Florence Ziegfeld, who did these fantastical Broadway follies, said, why don't you meet with my set designer, Joseph Urban? So she brings Joseph Urban down and ends up with something that really, truly did break the bank and defy all expectations. And she did that time and again in locations. And so she actually, with the camp up in the Adirondacks, Camp Topridge, she also completely rebuilt. And that was the model she used when she built Mar-a-Lago, was she used the model of the great camp in the Adirondacks with the central lodge or hall with a bunch of outbuildings so that she could entertain and host on the grandest of scales, but then also have it be, an intimate family home where her children and her grandchildren could come. And, obviously Mar-a-Lago, it's not log cabins, but it's the same model and the same layout. And that was really revolutionary for, that was, people kind of raised their eyebrows at that idea. But then she had the Sea Cloud, which was also a home to her. And she sailed the world on the Sea Cloud, and it was bigger than any of the yachts owned by J.P. Morgan and the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers. So that was really, really important and meaningful. When I visited Camp Topridge, it's privately owned now, and the family allowed me to spend the night, and they allowed me to stay in Marjorie's cabin, which is pretty much exactly as she left it. Her silver hairs are still in her brush, and there is a safe that they claim they have never been able to open. They've never broken into the safe, so who knows what's even in there. But you see then by her bed the little watercolors that her grandchildren made for her, and that's what mattered to her. That was what was closest to her heart. And so I'm getting ready to go to bed, and I honestly felt like the museum guards were going to have to come in and escort me out at any minute. It just felt really sacred. It was a very unique experience. So then I spent the night, and I woke up, and it's the Adirondacks, so it's very, very preserved. It's pretty much, when you open the window and look out over the lake, it's pretty much exactly as she would have seen it. It's still just the pristine wilderness, and you see the loons skimming across the lake, and you see the mist on the water, and just think this is what Marjorie would have seen when she woke up as a morning person. And so that is invaluable in the writing process, to just sort of see what she might have seen, imagine her in that place where you are. And so I just love that. I love the research part, and I loved the locations. I have not yet been on the Sea Cloud. Goals, dreams. I was doing a signing recently where someone came up and shared that they had stayed in Marjorie's suite in her stateroom. So life goals. But Hillwood, if you find yourself in the DC area, is so worth a visit, because you walk in. Dina Merrill said about Hillwood, it's as if mother could walk in and sit down to dinner. And if you know what it was like to sit down to dinner with Marjorie, if you've read the book, that is saying a lot, because she literally measured the place settings with a ruler, the fork, knife, and spoon before each meal. So that's just how well done it is. It's preserved to a standard that Dina Merrill felt her mother would have approved of. And, you go and you see her clothes hanging in the closet, meticulous. You see all the pink, and you see where her dogs are buried, and the gardens are incredible. So you really get a sense of her life there. I would highly recommend.
It's amazing how she really transcended and just did her own thing. Totally.
Yeah.
To Palm Beach.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make this my own.
Yeah. And attached it to the coral reef, so it would be hurricane proof. Marjorie didn't mess with the natural elements. And when she was in DC and she was building Hillwood, the landscapers came to her and said, if we clear some of this foliage and some of these trees and brush, you can have a great view of the Washington Monument. Marjorie was a patriot. She'd served multiple presidents for the United States, and said we have to have this view of the Washington Monument. But her architect said, we cannot move the French doors. We cannot get the French doors to frame the monument. And she's like, we've got to do it. We've got to move the French doors. We've got to get the perfect view. And I said, it can't be done. She said, it has to be done. So instead of moving the French doors, she just moved the Washington Monument. That's some Washington lore. But that just goes to show, like, Marjorie's can-do attitude. Nothing was impossible.
Marjorie, you got it.
Yeah, she had the verve and the wit and the talent and the money and the energy and the stick-to-itiveness to make things that would have been impossible to others possible. Like sending coolers full of vegetables to Russia in the middle of a famine in order to entertain and broadcast the riches of capitalism. You know, it was like frozen peas diplomacy. And, you know, rewiring the house herself with her own electrician and refurnishing it and bringing in her own toilets and bathtubs, you know. Marjorie was going to do things up to her standards.
The full set.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. You have a new novel coming out soon, Finding Margaret Fuller, another important woman in history. Let's talk about that novel.
Yeah.
And what's next for you?
Yes. So it is coming out in exactly 1 month. It is coming out in March, which is Women's History Month. Originally, when I was coming here today, it was already going to be out because originally we had a February pub date. And then the publisher bumped it back a month so it could be Women's History Month, which is March. But I thought, you know, Marjorie's also really great for the Palm Beach area because she's a Palm Beach woman. But I cannot wait to share Finding Margaret Fuller. So it's, again, an American heroine, again, a fascinating woman. For this one, we go to Concord, Massachusetts in the 19th century to the genius cluster that gave us the foundation of the American canon. So you have Ralph Waldo Emerson, his handyman living right upstairs by the name of Henry David Thoreau, his neighbors next door, the Alcotts, their rambunctious young daughter, Louisa May, and then just up the road, Nathaniel Hawthorne, living with his new bride, working on this book, The Scarlet Letter, and then you've got Melville coming in and out of town when he needs to take a break from working on this book that's torturing him about a white whale, and you have this genius cluster, and at the center of it, you have this woman who Ralph Waldo Emerson referred to as the radiant genius and fiery heart at the center, named Margaret Fuller. She was Emerson's muse and tormentor. She was who Nathaniel Hawthorne based Hester Prynne off of when he wrote The Scarlet Letter. When Sophia Hawthorne, his wife, read the first draft of The Scarlet Letter, she took to bed for the rest of the day with a headache because she knew it was not about her. She knew it was about Margaret Fuller. When Louisa May Alcott wrote Little Women about the 4 sisters in her life, she changed the eldest sister's name from Anna to Margaret to be after her mentor, Margaret Fuller. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton was Margaret's mentee, had asked Margaret to be the president of the convention of the National Women's Rights Convention in 1850. It didn't happen. Margaret was not able to take the place at the podium as the president. And if you read my book, you'll see why. I won't spoil it. But just a fascinating woman. She left Concord. She left this genius cluster, this little clique of transcendentalist artists and thinkers, because she said, the problem with Concord is that it's lacking in discord. And she wanted more than philosophy and poetry and love triangles and lust triangles. And so she left. She went to New York to work for Horace Greeley as a newspaper reporter covering the writings of Frederick Douglass and Karl Marx and the music of Beethoven. And then she wanted even more adventures, so she sailed alone to Europe, which was very scandalous for a woman, to accept the post offered by Greeley as America's first full-time foreign war correspondent. She went to cover the Roman Revolution, took a Roman count as a lover, had a child, sparked an international scandal, Hester Prynne, Scarlet Letter, and then it just takes off from there. So fascinating woman with real history as the raw material that just provides the most juicy, dramatic story. And it's called Finding Margaret Fuller, and it's available now for pre-order, and it will be in your hands a month from now if you order. Yeah.
We're very
So Finding Margaret Fuller.
we're excited to hear about all the intersections and those stories.
Yeah, we've all read every single, we've read Emerson, Hawthorne, Thoreau, Alcott.
Yes.
And then, the response I keep getting, she's the first woman to study at Harvard, just so many firsts. She was just a trailblazer, but the response I keep getting from the early readers and reviewers is, how do we not know you? You know, why do we not know her name as well as Emerson and Thoreau and Hawthorne?
I think you have the eyes about it. Just bring them to life.
I feel lucky every time I buy them. Thank you.
Sure, great talent.
Thank you.
It's really answer us great question. So what is it like touring as an author? Yes, I'm going.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you. I love it because I get to meet readers. And, you know, when I'm writing, it's solitary. It's the quiet work of writing and drafting and researching and editing and writing more. And I love my editor so much. I feel like it's truly a marriage in the sense that we are partners and with the same vision for the work. And then I get to come and meet readers, and it's wonderful. It's a very different piece of the job. You know, something that, you know, the writing is very inward facing and solitary, and then this is very outward facing. And I love both, and I love doing them both together because I think they really complement one another really nicely. And it is not terrible to come to Florida in February. So I love it. I will always come to a Florida invitation.
Okay. And do you have any advice for aspiring writers?
Yeah. Well, so I think everyone is an aspiring writer, right? Everyone pretty much, whatever the medium, whatever, you know, if it's art or music or dance or writing, I think we all have stories and we all, you know, have that creative drive. And so my advice would be just do it, start, you know, put the pen to paper. And if you want to write, start writing. And it's not going to be perfect. And it's never going to be perfect. It might not even be good. My first book is still sitting on my computer. Nothing's ever happened. I've got so many books still sitting on my computer. Maybe something will happen to some of them. Probably not all of them, but do it. Write every day. And then just be gentle with yourself and protective of yourself, to be sure not to share it too soon, because it's not necessarily going to be good if you're an aspiring writer and you're just beginning to write something. Be choosy about whose voices you allow to enter your head, and whose voices you allow to sort of become the voices that you internalize as you're writing. You know, guard your kernel and nurture it, and, you know, give it the time. Do the writing.
Dance is very important. You will let into your circle and hear it. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that rough job can be, you know, it's the most challenging part.
I still remember the feedback I got on the very first thing I wrote that I've never published, and it's probably if I were to look at it now, I'd be so grateful it never got published. But the earliest feedback just means the most. So be intentional about who you allow to have that sacred voice in your process.
I did you. Very important. Hey, thank you, Allison.
Well, thank you.
Question.
Yeah, we have time. And I can repeat the question back so everyone can hear.
I'm glad.
Okay.
I have facilitated women's book clubs for a very long time.
That's it.
And the best books that lend themselves are historical novels. And I think there's different levels of historical novels. Somebody will take one historical fact and none of the characters are true and nothing that really happens is true, but you've got that one historical nugget.
Exactly.
And then there's the ones that kind of in the middle. Yours are, and we've done every one of your books. So this is more common than the question. But I wanted to say that the research you do is extraordinary.
Thank you.
And every book, if you go back, and I do a lot of research when I prepare, it's all exactly what really happens in history. And to me, you are just making up the dialogue. And even some of that came from diaries and newspapers and people's journals. And so when I do any of your books, I just feel as if we're reading real history in such a loving and just enjoyable way. So I just want to thank you. Keep going, because I just used the whole
I just want to respond to that. Thank you. And the question came up really of how closely you stick to the history, right? And as you said, like some novels will get, or a writer will get like one instance and that inspires them, and then they build a story around that. And then I veer more towards almost biographical, historical fiction, but I write it as a novel. And the reason is because I also I agree with you, I love historical fiction. And I know I'm really into a book of historical fiction when I'm just going down the Google rabbit hole and I just need to know what happened. And so I think historical fiction is so great for many reasons, but in particular, it's a good entry point into history because it's not only educational, but it can be entertaining and accessible in a way that maybe a denser biography might be intimidating or people wouldn't pick it up to discuss it. So what I love about historical fiction is it puts you as an eyewitness into the moment that happened.
And sometimes you're disappointed if you've read a book and then you find out half of it's fluff.
Yeah.
It's not true.
Yeah, yeah.
But when you begin to say, what is, I'm reading this, but what's real or what's not.
Yeah, and then I begin to worry, like, oh, what if this is what I'm carrying with me in my head now, and I have the totally wrong idea of history because I'm remembering the ending of the book and sticking with me maybe more than the history. But I love, there's nothing that a reader could say that could mean more to me than that when they finished the book, they had to stay up and like Google and go down the rabbit hole because maybe they didn't like history in school, but then by reading historical fiction, they see history is the furthest thing from boring. History gives you all the raw material, and it's so good as just, you have everything in history. You have all the great stories.
The real.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I loved your book about Marjorie.
Thank you.
And so did my book club.
Thank you.
8 of us are here today.
Thank you.
So I was really intrigued by her time in Moscow. It kind of blew my mind. And
Same.
I was really curious about where you got the information about her time there, because they were so censored.
Yeah.
Phone calls and letters and everything. So where did you dig that up from?
Yeah. And that is all true in terms of tapping a glass with a pencil or running the faucet to break up the bugs because they knew they were being listened to. They had a couple, a Russian man and woman, living in their attic that the Russian government had planted there. And they knew they were there. And her job was to make friends for America. And so they had to accept it. And the way the Russians pitched it to them when they would get caught, being tailed was, oh, that's for your protection. So they knew they were being spied on. They knew that as soon as they got the bugs out, they were in, the next time they left the room. They knew the entire staff in the house was working to the precursor to the KGB. So that is all true. So she was not able to share that when she was posted to Moscow. But when they came home, they spoke about it very openly, particularly once it became clear as the specter of Hitler subsided and it became clear that then the Soviet Union was going to be the next rival with the United States. And there was not so much the need to befriend or court the friendship of the Soviets, then they could be, a lot more honest and open. But Joseph Davies wrote a very, very comprehensive memoir, Mission to Moscow, that had so many of those details. Everything from what they ate to what Marjorie packed in her coolers to bring over for food to the techniques they used to get around the bugs. That was all in there. And Marjorie talked about it with her family, so that was very well documented in the oral history that was distilled and provided by Hillwood and by her earliest biographers. And so all of that, I did not have to make up any of that. It is all pulled directly from the history because that's how it truly happened.
Thank you.
And the collecting. Really, they would just weigh the treasure and it'd be 1 gram, 1 ruble per gram. She would just find these things, heaped against the walls in warehouses, and she'd crawl on her hands and knees, like through the aisles, and pick up Catherine the Great's treasure, Anastasia's treasure, Rasputin's. That was true. It was all just sitting there, and the Soviets needed the money, so they were willing to sell it. She saved a lot of treasure. Yes.
After I read your book, I was at Hillwood.
Oh yeah.
And I was astonished at the amount of Russian artistry that she brought.
Yes.
And puffs in the coffee pots, and it was so magnified. I thought it was quite a bit in the book, but it was magnified.
Yeah.
Being there.
So interestingly enough, when I started working on Marjorie, I had one daughter, and then 6 years later, I had 3 daughters. When I was having my third baby, I was writing about Marjorie having her third baby. She was, she had 2 daughters. She was convinced this was a boy. She didn't even pick out a girl name. It was going to be Ned after her father, Ned Hutton. She has the baby. It's a girl. She doesn't have a name, so it's Nedinia. I'm pregnant with my 3rd child. I already have 2 girls. I'm convinced it's a boy. It's different. I'm sure it's a boy. I have a daughter. And I'm like, well, life is mirroring art here. But I'm not going to name her Davinia. We can come up with something better than that. But so after I had my daughter's name is not Davinia, I had family in town visiting to meet the baby, and we're in upstate New York, and it rained all weekend. So my mother-in-law gave me a book, and the book title was American Bloomsbury, and it was about this genius cluster, and it was Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, Alcott, Melville, Margaret Fuller. And I was an English major. I wrote my senior thesis on Poe. I knew, I thought I knew a lot about the Transcendentalists. I love their writing. I love their personal stories. I have visited Concord, Massachusetts multiple times. I've done the history dork walks, and I had never heard of Margaret Fuller. And she really, in this book, was the one who jumped off the page. And I thought, the story behind the story here, I never heard this. So I just became obsessed with her. I went back to Concord. I did more history dork walks and went deeper into her story, and was just had this feeling that I've had many times, which is, I'm so lucky that no one has done this yet. I need to do this before someone else lands here, and figures out this treasure trove.
You have a knack for that.
Oh, wow.
When you wrote Sissy, then like a couple of years later, I was in Venice, and there was a huge exhibition on her.
Yeah.
And I had never heard of her before.
Oh, yeah. Well, so Cece is, I heard about Cece when I was in college because my family is Hungarian, and we were visiting Budapest and Vienna and Prague, and we went to all of the stomping grounds of the former Habsburg Empire, and Cece was everywhere. I'm just thinking, Mad King Ludwig is like singing from the turrets of Neuschwanstein to Cece, and she is like, her hair is down to the floor, and she is this epic, larger-than-life kind of Princess Diana precursor. How have we not heard about her in America? And so I really loved the Cece story for so long, and that is just again felt like I had to write this story before someone else discovered her.
Thank you.
I have to say your books are not just for women.
Yeah.
My husband, the 2 Cece books, he adored.
Oh,
and
thank
they are
you.
so good.
Thank you
It's
so much.
And also this one, we listened to this one on a drive from New Jersey to Florida.
Oh, great.
And
Thank you.
enjoyed it. It's just, you're wonderful.
Ask you about your nonfiction book, which I
Yes.
thoroughly enjoyed.
Yes.
Yeah, but I felt like it was amazing. It's really a very good you wrote. What's to hang, but
Beauty and the Broken Place.
But I felt at the end, you sort of left. I don't know what happened. How's your husband doing?
Yeah. So that book was 6 years ago.
Yeah.
So yeah, the end is still being written.
That's what I figured.
Yeah. So when my husband and I were 30, we were expecting our first child, and we were on the plane to our baby moon. My husband was a resident, never saw him, worked all the time. I had just sort of gotten my footing under myself as a writer. I was working on Cece, and we were expecting our first child. We were living in Chicago. We were flying west. And my husband turned to me on the flight and said, "Does my eye look weird?" And I looked into his eye, and here's my husband, who is a doctor, lifelong athlete, annoyingly healthy eater, not a smoker, not a drinker, just has, a very, very clean bill of health. And he turns to me, and he works the emergency rooms in Chicago dealing with gunshot wounds, and he's not flappable. He's not, I was the hypochondriac, he was not. So I just threw out the most ridiculous thing I could think of so that he would be like, "Oh, you're being ridiculous. It's not a big deal." but I saw just the black of his eye had spread to the entire eye, just the one side, and it was the asymmetry that scared me. And I just said, "Are you having a stroke?" And he said, "I think I might be." And he lost consciousness, and he went into a coma, and that was. So we're flying, and we called the flight attendant, and they were like, "Okay, we have to make an emergency landing," because they couldn't resuscitate him on the plane. And I was like, "Okay, where are we landing?" And they were like, "We're going to land in Fargo, North Dakota." And I was like, "Okay, I've never been to Fargo, North Dakota. Do they have a good hospital?" And she was like, "Ma'am, we don't have a choice. We have to get on the ground." So we landed in Fargo, North Dakota. We wheeled him into the ICU. And the doctors there said, "You need to call his parents and tell them to come out just so they can get here in time to say goodbye." But we didn't think that he was going to make it through this stroke. And I was pregnant. The baby was going crazy in my stomach because of all the adrenaline and the cortisol and stress. And his parents flew out. My parents flew out to be with me. And they were all really worried about the baby and obviously about Dave. And we didn't know if he would wake up. Well, we didn't know if he would survive the night. He survived the night. Then we didn't know if he would wake up. Eventually, a few days later, he woke up. They didn't know if he did wake up, who would wake up, what version of who he would be. And he woke up on and off for a while. And he would just be awake long enough to maybe if we said, "Squeeze my hand," he could squeeze your hand and then he'd go back to sleep. And when he did wake up, like a month and a half later, there was an orientation and amnesia test to gauge how cognitively functional a human being is. And it's 1 to 100. And to be a lucid, cognitively functional person, you have to be between 80 and 100. And at a month and a half out, on a scale of 1 to 100, he was at an 8. He was completely amnestic. He didn't know anything. He was in the hospital because we medevaced him eventually from Fargo back to Chicago, back to the hospital where he was a surgeon. He couldn't tell you he was in his hospital where he spent every day of his life. He couldn't tell you we were in Chicago. He couldn't tell you what year it was. He couldn't tell you who I was. It was just, he was completely, wiped clean. And when a newborn, the first things they do, they cry, with healthy lungs, and they drink milk. They can swallow milk. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't swallow. He was less functional than the newborn. He was on a tube. He was being intubated. He was being fed through an IV. Total life support. So I was just living through this with him, and our baby was about to come, and I was, with him all day, every day in the ICU, and it was a big day when he could swallow liquids and just, through the milestones of waking up and coming back to life. And so what I did was, as a writer, I wrote my way through the process. I didn't realize I was doing it. He slept a lot. He was like a newborn. So I'd just be sitting there in the hospital room next to the bed with all the chirps and the beeps, and I would just pull out my laptop and I would write. I would journal. I would sort of just process, take inventory. And at the same time that was happening, we were just receiving so much mail from people in Dave's life, coaches, teammates, friends, coworkers, people he had been a camp counselor for, and everyone was just writing Dave letters, and I was collecting them all because I was like, wouldn't it be so wonderful if someday Dave could read these and remember what he used to be like, or remember these people, remember the relationships he used to have, understand the impact he had on these people, like almost like hearing your own eulogy over and over again, but he's alive. Maybe he'll get to absorb this someday. And I was like, wouldn't it be so wonderful if maybe someday he will be cognitive enough to ask questions about what the hell happened and what the hell he and I went through. So I just wrote it all down. And so he had this really rare stroke where there was literally not even case literature on how to rehab him, because it was so rare that a person of his profile should not have had the stroke and then should not have survived. So he was literally studied as like a case study. So the blessing and the curse in that was that they could not give us a prognosis. They could not tell us what to expect. They had no idea what they were working with. And so that gave us the opportunity to just keep fighting for the next miracle and to just keep defying the odds and to just keep pushing the goalpost and to just keep working every day at rehab and our goals. And so he kept fighting, he kept working. We had our baby. He was in rehab, he was in therapy, and about a year later, so it happened in June of 15, so June of 16, when he was stable, he wasn't 100%, but we'd had our baby, he had survived, he was sort of coming back, as a person. Things were stable. My editor and my agent asked me if I would ever consider writing about this experience. And I had no interest in writing. I write, are you crying? Or, I wrote fiction. I wrote historical fiction. Writing was my happy place. Writing was my passion. I had no interest in writing about this. And I hadn't even realized I'd been writing about it for a year. And I just realized, when I came home from the hospital alone every night after 12 hours and I crawled exhausted in a bed, I needed to read this book. I needed a book like this to feel less alone and less scared and less overwhelmed. And so I came around to the idea of, if I can write this book and it can be meaningful for one person, on the journey. And maybe it will be cathartic and healing, and maybe one day my daughter will read it, or maybe one day Dave will read it. And so I did it, and it's called Beauty of the Broken Places, and it came out in 18. And so the stroke is 15. So yeah, in 18, it was really, we were still getting our footing, but 9 years this June, it's doing great. We have 3 daughters. He's back to work. He's in medicine. He's with my daughters right now so that I can come and do this. I tell them I have to go to a Taylor Swift concert, but it's about dogs. And it's really like a miracle. He's wow. He's right. Is it time? What? So one more question. Yes, we've had 2.
Actually, this is not a question, and yeah, I'm almost in tears. This is probably one of my all-time favorite books. The breadth of it is extraordinary, and she was an extraordinary person. You are a wonderful writer. Thank you. And speaker. They said into quite a few authors. Half of us are from New York. Yeah. So, and I just really want to thank you for being here. Wish your family the best and keep writing.
Thank you.